Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, where we will be taking a look at a modern procurement function and what does that mean to have a modern procurement function. My name is Brandon Till. I'm the head of transformation at Soldo. At Soldo, we deal with spend management for companies, really trying to fill in that missing layer for procurement teams between, purchasing and payment to give procurement teams control and visibility of spend, in particular, everyday spending, tail spending that can cause a lot of stress and a lot of chaos within the function. So we'll be looking at it through that lens. And I'm very happy to be joined by Ashok Patel from IDC. Ashok, maybe you can give us a little introduction.
My name's Ashok Patel from IDC. We're an analyst firm looking at the tech market in particular. And my area within there is the European enterprise application space. And my main focus tends to be on the kind of operational functions applications. So kind of ERP, touching on supply chain, but a big area is procurement, which is obviously great for today. And it actually draws a lot on my experience as a buyer. I started my career as a buyer in the UK automotive industry. So being able to bring a couple of different hats to the table today with that experience, as well as my experience as an industry analyst looking at the software market and what's going on in the procurement functions around the world.
That's great. We've been talking to now, Ashok. We met you a few years ago. I've gotten the chance to meet with you and to be able to break down this framework, to break it down of what does a modern procurement function look like within 3 elements. So maybe give us an intro. What are we looking at today?
So we've broken it down into 3 kind of key areas. The first being the need for change. So what's really driving change within businesses at the moment, and what are buyers experiencing that makes this such an important topic to discuss at this point in time. On the second level, we've got how the procurement function is evolving. So what does the modern procurement function look like in the companies that are furthest along in their modernization process? And then third, we've got some of the key areas and key elements that organizations need to embrace and that buyers need to be aware of and be driving forward when it comes to that modernization of the procurement function.
Let's dive in. What is the need to change?
When it comes to the need for change, I mean, obviously change has always been a part of business, but it feels like the last probably 5 years or so, there's been more happening that's affecting businesses on a very core level than we've ever seen in the past. And that's true of pretty much every company, irrespective of the industry or the country they're operating in. And when we can have a look at those different challenges, I broadly categorize them into 3 key areas. The first is more of a kind of a geopolitical and macroeconomic space. So some of the geopolitical tensions that we've seen that are reshaping supply chains and the way that businesses operate. But on top of that, we've got inflationary pressures and interest rate fluctuations that we've seen have a big impact in Europe, particularly in terms of how organizations are being able to invest going forward. And then on top of that, really over the last, let's say, year or so, we've seen a huge rise in concerns around international trade, treaties, tariffs, and the like, all of which is adding a lot more complexity into what buyers have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So that's that kind of external macro perspective. Then the next level down, we have kind of more traditional procurement challenges. So we've got regulatory concerns, most recently around ESG, particularly in Europe. That's driving a lot of change and a lot of renewed focus when it comes to buyers. We also have some of the budgetary accountability elements as well that come into play, with businesses being a lot more focused on their finances and where their budget is going, getting more for less, essentially. On top of that, we have obviously supplier risk, a big factor that's been happening in Europe with the way that the finances are going, companies going bust or potentially having problems with their finances. And then we've got the broader digital transformation, something that's kind of been on the agenda for 10 years or so, but it's really coming to the fore and has accelerated over the last couple of years. And then another step down, we've got the kind of almost internal functional challenges you see within procurement. So, as a buyer, you're dealing with those internal disconnects and lack of integration, both with your applications and your processes around the business. As a result of that, you have the immature data sets that result from that, not having the full visibility that you need of what's happening in the organization. You're also dealing with a lot of manual processes and also maverick spend, where different teams are going out and spending money in a way that hasn't really been approved and isn't really going through the proper channels.
Interesting. I think at Soldo, what I've seen is people coming to us for, I like your categories. I think it's largely for reasons 2 or 3. Some people coming saying, hey, we're looking for some more control of this uncertain economic environment, the sort of reason 1 you gave. But how do we help better control our spending and getting better visibility of this thing. And the other one would be more operation three of saying, how do we help speed things up? We're kind of not operating at the speed of the rest of business. And the procurement function in particular is trying to say, how do we keep up? How do we do more with less? Can you give us a way to speed things up? So I could see between those two, whether it's control or whether it's speed within the business, we've definitely seen people looking for as well.
Absolutely. And it's these kind of challenges that are then kind of leading companies to actually explore, how do you reimagine procurement so that it's less exposed to a lot of these challenges and can actually help you kind of take the next steps in terms of becoming a more forward-looking procurement function, procurement team, and individual buyers as well. So yeah, a lot of those pressures are kind of reshaping, remolding procurement as they are in a lot of other parts of the business as well. I mean, if we have a look at that shift in procurement function, what I've got here is the kind of traditional sense of what procurement is, which is very much focused on transactional tasks, a lot of focus on kind of administration in and around that, a big focus on costs, because obviously procurement tend to be the area that costs come into play the most. But on top of that, we also have a very kind of inward and backward looking function. So one that's really focused on being reactive as other parts of the business take actions and having to try to kind of rein in some of that spend, and very focused on manual kind of administration, having to try and gather it all as the buyer yourself rather than being able to rely on other tools and technologies that you have. But as I mentioned, we are seeing that transition, and it's really a shift from that inward backward look to a kind of outward forward looking function. So one that is much more kind of focused on the kind of the big picture when it comes to strategy. And that's not just buying advice as we've got here, but also adding into that strategic thinking, strategic buying, strategic sourcing, all of those different elements. A big focus on being more proactive, buyers getting involved at a much earlier stage in the buying process. And ideally before the buying is even needed within that process, just to be able to give that advice and that insight as early as possible. And also focused on how to deliver value, not just cost, but also value to the business and the buyer.
That makes sense. I've worked with a customer of ours who was talking about how they were happy to be able to provide Solo as a modern solution for part of their procurement function. And they're really trying to put themselves on that roadmap of going from something they saw was quite reactive and being like, oh, now this has to go through procurement, to being that more of a partner and more of that strategic leader to the business, to saying, it's a road, right? It's a path to get there. But moving from being just a process and a team that you need to go through that has to control costs and keep things under check, while that is important, to being something like you're saying, how do you help deliver actual value? How do you be a strategic partner and an advisor to the business?
Exactly. It's that kind of shift of operational bottleneck to strategic facilitator within the business. You still need to do a lot of the core elements, but you can do it in a smarter, more efficient way that helps other parts of the business rather than is seen as a hindrance. And that actually, I think, brings us nicely on to some of the key elements that we see as important for organizations that are trying to embrace this concept of the modern procurement function. And we can break it down into three core categories. So we've got technology, we have process, and we have mindset. It's important, I think, to highlight that all of these need to be done in collaboration and conjunction with each other. But I think it's good to try and separate them out, because there are some core elements within each of these that really need to be delivered upon in order to help that transition process. So if we start with technology, just as a first point, I think it's fair to say that procurement is probably the lowest priority for a lot of businesses when it comes to investment in technology. And we can see some of our data points here from a survey we've done across EMEA, where half of all buyers say they're still dependent on on-premise applications, and nearly 2/3 say that their applications are just not fit for purpose for their daily requirements. And I've had that experience myself as a buyer. When I joined the buying team around 15 years ago, we were still using applications that were built in the late 80s, early 90s. They hadn't really been updated or modernized. And we were actually running 2 different procurement systems across 3 different sites. And they each had their own functionality. They each had their own interface. They could do different things. So you had to remember which application was for which site to know exactly which type of interface you needed to use and what it could do. Some, for example, could backdate prices, others couldn't. And it does make it very complicated.
Yeah, I see that. And I still think it's that you feel like, okay, we could just make this system work a little longer. We can make this system work a little longer, pushing these things. And eventually you get to a point where you start looking back and say, there's almost a procurement penalty or a productivity penalty, they should say, of being like, this is no longer something, even just because I can make it work, because procurement people are willing to jump through the hoops and make it work for the business. It's probably just slowing them down to a point of there's got to be a better way to do it.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is that with these numbers, they're the highest proportion across any part of the business, which I think goes to emphasize what you're saying. It's really the buyers that then have to try and make up the gap between what the applications do and what the business needs them to do. So investing in new applications is an essential part of that transition, because new applications can be more easily integrated. They can help buyers act faster, and they can provide much better insights for the buyer to help not just the buyer in their daily job, but also help the business as well.
No, it makes sense. I think now two people hear about AI and AI coming. You mentioned there's been so much change in the last 5 years it's coming, but it's also, I think you've got to be able to free up enough time to make a plan for this as well. And oftentimes, are you spending all of your time? Are you already underwater processing enough POs? Whereas your technology not freeing up enough time that you're able to consider what is the technology we replace first? What's the roadmap here in the digital transformation?
Yes, absolutely. And I think kind of along with that transition to a new application, new technology, it's also worth, I think, highlighting that doing that alone probably won't generate the change that you want, because if you just do technology and you don't modernize your processes, you're not going to really make the most of those applications. So when we kind of think about that process side of things, we can see here that 70% of respondents to our survey have said that they expect there to be a major overhaul in their supply chain operations, which includes procurement over the next 5 years. So a massive shift that requires a lot of process modernization within these organizations as well, in which there is this push. You mentioned AI and this idea of embracing a greater level of automation. And ideally intelligent automation as well, where the applications can take more of that administrative burden, as well as helping guide when it comes to things like dynamic sourcing. But then we also see things around data and data democratization, analytics, to provide greater insights to the buyer so that the buyer can make better buying decisions, but can also help the business make better decisions in its strategies as well. And then in addition to all of that, we kind of see this idea of building everything around some more updated modern frameworks and best practices, where they can lean on vendors such as yourselves to go, okay, what are people doing in this market who are kind of leading the way to try and gain a step above where they are at the moment?
It makes what we use. I mean, I've been told that we're offering a technology that help people with their processes. It makes sense that these pillars go hand in hand, not one after another. They're kind of going at the same time, because we see too, it's not awareness. It's not that teams don't know our processes are slowing things down, or this would be a way to help the business or to help myself with a better process or technology to enable a process. It's about execution, and where do you start, and how do we find something that we're able to execute, not just knowing this is the problem, but this is where we need to start and where we need to move to. This is the specific process to modernize, or this is the legacy tool holding us back.
Yes, absolutely. And I think especially when we think about tail spend, being able to embrace these different things and incorporate them into different parts of the organization, they provide key elements that help that tail spend be much more visible and much easier to control, I think, and much easier to understand, in a way that, buyers can go from spending 80% of their time managing that 20% of their spend to actually reversing that situation.
It's one of those things that's almost feels like a necessary evil, like this, that the everyday buying the business has to do to operate, but it ends up consuming so much time, and it really can fall on procurement, at times finance as well, but spending so much of their time on what's ultimately not the strategic purchase. It's not where they want to be or should be spending their time, but they sort of have to get it done because there's no other way. So I think it's one of those areas of saying, if you can fix tail spend, does that help free up the time you need to be that strategic advisor, or to free up time and to do more from your position in procurement?
Yes, absolutely. And I think with that also comes the next key element we see around mindset, because you can improve that transactional process, but I think you also need to redevelop the thought process within the business around who the buyer is to the business and what they can deliver to the business. And, we see that in a shift from cost to value when it comes to perceptions of buying. Just to be clear, that's not to say that cost is going to be disregarded as a metric. that's never going to happen. When it comes to buying, cost is always going to be a key element here. But it's more about exploring that cost as a given, but then also looking at the value that can be delivered to the business on top of that cost control when it comes to buying. So, being able to provide better insights to the organization, and the organization looking to the buyers for those insights, being able to use a lot of these new processes and technologies to reduce risk at the earliest possible stage, so that you have that visibility, you reduce it without it becoming a sticking point later on in the sourcing process. And then on top of that, we also see that the kind of buyers helping faster, better, more data-driven decision-making, not just within procurement, but also outside of the procurement and all the other stakeholders that are involved.
Yeah, I love that the mindset is part of your framework in that you think it's easy to bring in another tool, bring in a new process, but really it does start with the mindset to me. And it's like, do you have this vision of what procurement should be to the business to unlock that position as a growth partner, as a strategic partner to the business, where it's not, oftentimes I think procurement can be blamed and ends up as a place where people look to say, oh, it got stuck in procurement, and that's the reason why it didn't go. And to have that mindset of we need to switch it around. And it doesn't happen overnight, but to start to think about how do we build that up is huge.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. I think being a buyer can often be a kind of thankless task, because you're told by the company you need to manage costs, and then you're told by everyone else that you're blocking everything from happening, everything that they need. And I think that's why kind of the second element I want to touch on in value is value to the buyer as well. Because, as I kind of mentioned, that idea of procurement being a bottleneck, no one goes into procurement to hold things up. No one goes in to be a bottleneck. The vast majority of buyers I know went into buying because they want to be able to help. They have a lot of strategic capabilities, but they don't have an opportunity to release those because of the administrative burden they're on. I've had my fair share of experiences where, I've had to bury myself in spreadsheets for days upon days to try and tally up a purchase order to a invoice to a payment to figure out where there was an anomaly because we had underpaid or overpaid a supplier. And it's not a particularly fun experience to wake up in the morning going, okay, another day where I'm just head down in a spreadsheet rather than thinking about what could be next for the organization.
We did a study ourselves earlier this year around productivity and employees. And we saw that about making funds available to the business. Like you're saying, if you're stuck there doing spreadsheets, trying to make sure you're covering costs, which is the role of procurement, but at the same time, how do you help enable that business? And there was a couple of things that really stood out to me in that study. And one said that 39% of employees felt that just having access to their own money would make them more productive to be able to do more for the business. So that's, I think, if we look at that through that lens of value to the business, value to the buyer, it's freeing up that time for the procurement with work with something like Solo, but it's also then providing that value to the business. Because the other side of that was 66% of senior leaders were spending more than 6 hours a week just on spend admin and dealing largely with that tail spend or everyday spend or within T&E or these other areas. How do they help reconcile that spend? So you have multiple people across the business, heads in spreadsheets, doing this stuff, regular everyday management tasks, and you're not doing your other job, which is helping to grow the business, helping to move things forward.
Exactly. And so I think that's kind of the element that I think often gets lost in the conversation about values. A buyer's time is as precious as anyone else in the company, and being able to take the time to go, okay, what do you want from your career? Do you want to be head down in spreadsheets and that's really it? Or do you want to have an element of growth, an element of strategy and strategic thinking that you can bring to the business? So that's why I've kind of included here, and actually to try and treat them essentially equally, where both become fundamental to that value discussion. At the end of the day, a happier buyer is more often than not a better buyer. They're a more efficient buyer, and they can contribute more in critical areas of the business to help the business grow and mature as it wants to, as opposed to being seen as that bottleneck.
I love that. Not two separate things. It's one and the same, right? Happier buyers are better buyers.
Exactly. And so I guess just to take it on to the next step, because I think it's great to say that all these things are what companies are doing, but from a buyer's perspective, how can you influence it? Because as I said, more often than not, if a buyer doesn't get involved, the business aren't really going to be taking the lead to get the buyer involved. It's one of those conundrums where the very same people that criticize procurement as the bottleneck will also be the first people to turn around and steer investment outside of procurement because they think another area is more valuable to invest in. So I think buyers can take a pretty significant role in driving things forward when it comes to modernization. And so we've got a handful of key action points, I think, that buyers can actually take forward with them to help shape their own destiny to some extent. So, when we think about technology, the reality is that buyers know better than anyone how bad their tools are and the limitations that their tools have and the impact it has on them as a buyer, the impact it has on the business. So it's therefore essential that the buyers take the lead in demanding better technologies. As you see everyone else getting all this investment in AI, in new cloud-based applications, well, buyers need to be in that discussion as well. They need to have the tools that enable them to help the business face the challenges it faces, that enable them to have visibility, to have control, to have automation, and advocate for those platforms as a kind of a key next step in the company's evolution. On top of that, we've also got the process, and this can be quite a tricky one because you're obviously involving people outside of procurement as well. But I think it's really important, especially when it comes to things like tail spend, to try and really emphasize and take ownership of that tail spend. It will involve collaboration, a lot of collaboration with finance, sales and marketing, with operations, and all of the other teams that you're involved with. But by taking hold of that tail spend and by bringing in clearer policies, by trying to automate as much as possible where applicable and drive easier approval processes, for example, and by ensuring data flows more seamlessly, not just from the internal stakeholder to use the buyer, but also back again to emphasize, actually, if you brought me in earlier, I could have saved you this much money or saved you this much time. That can help build a much more robust ecosystem in and around this more fragmented spend and turn it from very fragmented, very dispersed, very kind of individualistic into something that is much more collective and strategic in the processes that happen. And then finally, on the mindset side, I think it's really important that buyers embrace and emphasize their strategic potential. I think it's an area that a lot of the time businesses acknowledge when they want to, but try to kind of avoid when they need to. I think, if you're not just managing spend, you're not just spending that time on the administrative side of things, but you can actually help use the insights you have as a buyer and deliver value, not just focus on cost, then it helps that transition from other people in the business seeing you as a bottleneck to actually seeing you as a facilitator, and helps other people in the business to be able to make faster decisions, to be able to stay compliant much more easily, and to unlock value in tail spend. Because at the end of the day, it's a lot of time, it's their budget that you're spending, and you can help them spend less and do more with what they have.
I love this as a framework and a good place to start. When we look at it at Soldo, we see oftentimes a challenge is there's that need to control costs, and that's always going to be part of procurement. But you can't control what you can't see. And the challenge with tail spend in particular is you don't see it until after it's happened. And people are there submitting receipts or these things. Oh yeah, that's in bounds, or that wasn't in policy. And you're always chasing it until if you're handling it as a reactive process, you're always going to be on that back foot playing catch up. And it makes it so hard to get to that strategic leadership point if you're not being more proactive on it. And that's where we're helping people to say, can we help you see? Can you give you that visibility into what's being spent through this system to proactively program cards for people and be able to give people money to handle that tail spend, but proactively control it? Because the other side of it is, you want to build a good process and you want to empower these people with streamlined approvals, with good policy. But if you don't trust the people, you can't really build an empowering policy on top of it. So how do you help build trust with the policy that's going to build in guardrails? Can you bring in that modern tool? What we offer at Soldo is a modern tool to say, yeah, we can help you streamline those approvals and ultimately enforce that policy ahead of time. So your process is one built on trust. It's one built on a way to control spending while empowering people. And it's one where ultimately, if you free up time, if you can get rid of that tail spend, I think for procurement, you can really help to become that strategic leader, because while it's not a huge amount of spend in terms of volume, in volume, it's a lot. In terms of value, it's so much in terms of time that ends up being like more POs and not solving that problem. Yeah. So a little bit on Soldo, if people aren't familiar, we do provide this spend management platform, this combination of a tool that you can give employees access to company funds through cards, whether it's physical or virtual. They have access to a mobile app, whether you can track it, ask for funds, get permissions, and then keep everything in one platform. So all of this T&E spend, it's going through that streamlined process. It is giving you control. It's giving you visibility, and all of that decentralized purchasing that's going around. You're setting the rules ahead of time, and giving teams a way to do it. It's instead of me telling you about it, an easier way to do it. There's a QR code on screen. You can scan that and get all a number of assets about how to tame your tail spend and things we can do. Something we've helped a lot of companies with. And I think if you combine this with some of the insights, I appreciate the stories and insights speaking from the experience and the framework. I think it's a way that you can take control and start putting this into action, demanding better tools, owning that process, and ultimately leading strategically. Do you have any final thoughts or final words, Ashok?
The main thing from my side is, as a buyer, it is essential that you do take ownership of it, because no one else in the business will. And I know from experience how demoralizing it can be to always be seen as that bottleneck. And you don't have to be. There's ways not to be that, and there's ways not to be seen as that. So yeah, it's really a case of taking that ownership, really driving forward that modernization process in procurement so that you as a buyer can do what you want to be doing on the strategy side rather than doing what you have to do on the administrative side.
I will leave it at that as a way to free up to be agents of change in the business. I guess everyone's fate is in their own hands. Well, thank you for the framework. Thank you for spending time. Hopefully everyone found this insightful. I am Brandon Till from Soldo. Appreciate spending time today, and I hope you take some time to look us up. Thank you, Ashok, for your time and sharing all this insight with us.